Hi all, this is Priyadharshini working as an assistant professor in the Department of Artificial Intelligence and Data Science. So in the previous session we saw what is a deadlock, a system model, and then we saw how the deadlock is being characterized. So we saw a deadlock can be occur if the four conditions hold simultaneously in a system. So what are they? It is a mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, circular wait. So now in this video we'll see how to detect cycles in a deadlock. So the main and the important thing that you have to see in a deadlock is about the resource allocation graph. In short, we call it as RAM. So deadlock can be better described by using a directed graph called the resource allocation graph. So as you all know, if you talk about a graph, it should contain a set of vertices and the set of edges. So in this resource allocation graph, so the set of vertices B is of two types. So it can be partitioned into two types. One is a set of processes and the other one is the set of resources. So it is described by P, which is P1, P2, etc. up to Pn. So it consists of all the processes in the system, and R, which is characterized as R1, R2, etc. up to Rm. This set describes or consists of all resource types in the system. When we talk about edges in the resource allocation graph, we have two. One is request edge and the other one is assignment edge. So request edge is nothing but it is a directed edge when a process is requesting for a resource type. If the assignment edge means it is a directed edge again where when a resource is allocated to the process, then it turns into an assignment edge. So if a resource allocation graph contains a cycle, then we say a deadlock may exist. That is, if P1 is requesting for R1 and R1 is currently held by P2 and P2 is requesting for R1, then there exists a cycle, which means there will be a deadlock. So continuation of resource allocation graph. So diagrammatically the resource allocation graph can be represented as follows. So the processes will be represented by the circles. So P1, P2, etc. it will be represented as circles. The resource type in the rectangular box, or you can say a square box. So if the resource, for example, if the resource type consists of 4 instances, consider a printer has 4 instances, then that printer type will be denoted by 4 dotted circles. Then we call the edges, that is the assignment edge. So assignment edge means if the process is holding an instance of Rj and if there is a request edge when a Pi requests an instance Rj. So this is how it will be in the diagrammatic representation of the graph. So for example, so if P1 requests Ra, so this is the first diagram. So resource is required or the resource is requested. So in the B diagram, so when a process is hold a resource, then it will be represented like this. So this is an assignment example for an assignment edge. If in the case of third diagram, there is a condition called circular wait. So listen carefully. The process P1 requests Ra. That Ra is currently held by the process P2 and the P2 request RB, in which this resource RB is held by P1. Remember, here there is only one instance of all the resources. So this contains a cycle. So P1 to R1, R1 to P2, P2 to R1 and R1 again to P1. So this forms a circle. So here there is a deadlock. So consider another diagram where the resources are 3 instances and 2 instances. So here there is no cycle since we have more instances. So there is no deadlock and there is also no cycle. So the basic facts you have to know: a graph with a cycle but there is no deadlock. So if graph contains no cycle, then there is no deadlock. If however a graph contains a cycle, then there are 2 possible situations. That is, if there is only one instance per resource type, then deadlock may occur. If there are several instances per resource type, there is a possibility of no deadlock. So this is an example of a graph with a cycle, but there are no deadlocks since the resource types there are several instances per resource type. So example of resource allocation graph, consider the resource allocation graph. So here the processes are P1, P2, P3, resources are R1, R2, R3, R4, the edges are P1 to R1, P2 to R3, and the assignment edges are R1 to P2, R2 to P1, R3 to P3. So here P1 is holding an instance of R2 and is waiting for an instance of R1. P2 is holding an instance of R1 and instance of R2 and is waiting for an instance of R3. P3 is holding an instance of R3. So this is how a resource allocation graph would be there in a diagrammatical way. So here an example of resource allocation graph with the deadlock. So here the process P1 is waiting for P2 process to release R1, P2 is waiting for R3 held by P3, and P3 is waiting for either P1 or P2 to release R2. So here there is a cycle and it forms a deadlock. Thank you.